The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation. Lawyers rustled papers, spectators whispered in hushed tones, and in the background the distant, steady sound of a gavel striking echoed from another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench with her gaze fixed and professional, her expression one of unyielding composure. It was another day, another case, or so she thought, as the bailiff announced the matter before her. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the polished oak surface of the bench. In front of her lay the case files detailing charges of assault, robbery, and resisting arrest. A familiar ache of disappointment began to settle in her chest as she contemplated yet another lost soul ensnared in a broken system. When the defendant was finally led in, the world around her seemed to slow. The man, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was James Anderson. Her James. In that charged moment, a flood of memories surged forth. The summer afternoons racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. The late-night talks they shared under the magnolia tree in her own backyard. The promises made in youthful secrecy to always stand by one another, no matter the cost. But the man before her was no longer the carefree boy of those halcyon days. His shoulders drooped with the burdens of years filled with hardship. His face bore the lines and scars of a life marred by injustice and neglect. Yet, despite the toll that time and circumstance had taken upon him, his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, remained unmistakably familiar. For the first time in her long career, Eleanor's grip on the gavel wavered. The room seemed to close in around her as she struggled to reconcile the past with the present reality. She drew a deep, steadying breath and, summoning every ounce of her judicial resolve, addressed him. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" The defendant's voice, roughened by years of hardship, emerged almost as a whisper. "Not guilty, Your Honor." His words, simple yet laden with an indescribable weight, sent a jolt through Eleanor's heart. In that instant she longed to demand answers, to know what had happened, why their lives had diverged so drastically from the innocent promises of childhood. Yet, her duty as a judge demanded that she remain impartial. "Proceed," she instructed, her voice steadier than she felt, as the prosecutor began his opening statements. Even as the prosecutor's measured tone detailed the alleged crimes, Eleanor's mind was transported back to another time, a time when she had not yet been burdened with the heavy mantle of authority. She recalled the days of her youth in Hammond, a small, segregated town where her family's modest one-story home, complete with a white picket fence, stood in stark contrast to the dilapidated house where James's family lived at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by open fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly, a secret bond that defied the rigid social barriers imposed upon them. She remembered vividly the day they met, an accidental encounter by a babbling creek on the outskirts of her backyard. James had been fishing, his line tangled in reeds, and without hesitation she had offered her help. That small act of kindness blossomed into years of shared adventures, whispered dreams, and a promise that they would always have each other's backs, no matter what the world might say. On one such summer night, as they lay side by side on the cool grass beneath a star-studded sky, James had confided, "Do you ever think about leaving this place? Really getting out? Going somewhere where people don't judge us for simply being together?" Eleanor had laughed, dismissing the notion as a childish fancy. Yet even then, James's eyes shone with a knowing intensity, a quiet understanding that the world, in its relentless cruelty, did not make room for people like him. Their friendship, tender and defiant, grew in the shadows of disapproval. Whispers, sideways glances, and outright condemnation from their peers pressed in on them like a suffocating weight. Then, as fate would have it, the inevitable happened. It was the summer before high school, when Eleanor's father, stern and unyielding, caught them together on the porch. His voice, cold and authoritative, commanded, "Eleanor, get inside. Now." With a resigned whisper, James murmured, "Go on." And in that heart-wrenching moment, their worlds irrevocably separated. Her father forbade her from ever returning to him, and soon after, his family moved away. In the years that followed, Eleanor immersed herself in her studies, her ambitions propelling her far from the confines of Hammond. Her ambitions propelling her far from the confines of Hammond. She went on to law school, driven by an unyielding desire for justice and fairness, yet the memory of James, the boy who had once shown her the true meaning of courage, never left her. Now, standing in the cold sterility of the courtroom, Eleanor was forced to confront that buried past. The memories of youthful promises clashed violently with the harsh reality of the present. As she looked upon James Anderson, now a man molded by a world that had failed him, Eleanor's heart ached with the knowledge of all that had been lost. She wondered silently, what had become of him? His criminal record, reduced to a few minor arrests and petty offenses, scarcely captured the complexities of his life. But then the prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the grim present, detailing the alleged assault of a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries and the cash register had been emptied. James had been apprehended a few blocks away, with the stolen cash still in his possession. Eleanor studied James intently as the prosecutor's narrative unfolded. His posture was slumped, his hands tightly clasped before him, yet his expression remained unreadable, an inscrutable mask that offered no clues as to whether he was guilty or if the truth lay hidden beneath layers of misjudgment. The courtroom eventually adjourned for a lunch break, leaving Eleanor with a heavy, lingering silence as she returned to her chambers. There, her assistant Margaret approached with a hesitant look. "Judge Hayes, are you all right? You seem distracted," Margaret asked softly. Eleanor managed a tight smile and replied, "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But deep down, she knew that the painful past she had long buried was now threatening to overwhelm her. When the trial resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with tension. Reporters scribbled notes feverishly, the clerk shuffled papers nervously, and the prosecutor, a sharply dressed man named Richard Powell, stepped forward to deliver his opening statement with a clinical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about violence. It is about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the contents of the cash register. The evidence will prove beyond doubt that James Anderson is guilty." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach as Powell's detached, almost mechanical tone reduced James to a mere name on a docket. Soon after, the defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to deliver her opening statement. Young, yet confident, her clear voice carried across the courtroom. "The prosecution would have you believe that this case is straightforward," she declared firmly, "but my client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the very beginning. We will show that there is far more to this story than the assumptions made on the night of his arrest." Her words, imbued with a quiet challenge, hung in the air, demanding the jury look beyond the surface. The first witness called to the stand was a store clerk who had been working on the night of the incident. With careful detail, he recounted how he had observed a man fitting James's description enter the store, engage in a heated argument with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. Yet, despite the precision of his account, there was an unmistakable quality of rehearsal in his testimony. Under the surgical cross-examination by Lisa Porter, the witness was forced to admit that he had not seen the attacker's face clearly. "Mr. Chambers," Lisa asked deliberately, "you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" "Yes," he replied, his voice uncertain. "But did you see his face clearly?" "Not really, it was dark and he had his hood up." Lisa nodded slowly and pressed on. "So you could not definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" The witness's hesitance and eventual admission confirmed her suspicions, leaving a ripple of doubt among the jurors. Eleanor noticed a subtle change in James during the witness's testimony. His shoulders straightened just slightly, as if the exchange had ignited within him a spark of hope. Next, the prosecution presented a grainy surveillance video from the store. The poorly lit footage depicted a figure in a red hoodie entering the establishment, quickly seizing something from the counter before vanishing from view. Although the prosecution insisted that the figure was James, the quality of the video rendered any definitive identification nearly impossible. Eleanor studied the footage intently, silently questioning, could this really be James? The figure moved with such speed that it left an unsettling gap in the narrative, deepening the mystery. Much of James's defense rested on an alibi. He claimed that at the time of the robbery he had been walking home from a friend's house. However, the friend was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community, a fact that only added to the enigma. Lisa Porter argued that while the absence of a willing witness did not conclusively prove James's innocence, it certainly cast serious doubt on the prosecution's case. As the trial wore on, the expressions of the jury ranged from skepticism to uncertainty, and Eleanor felt the weight of her own conflicted loyalties pressing down on her. Throughout the trial, Eleanor's internal struggle grew. As the presiding judge, she was expected to remain the epitome of impartiality and fairness, and yet every moment in the courtroom was a painful reminder of her own past. A time when the boy she once loved and admired was her closest friend. Now that boy stood before her, transformed by life's cruel twists into a man fighting desperately for his freedom, while she was tasked with deciding his fate. When the court finally adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface of the gavel. She longed to speak with James, to ask him directly what had happened on that fateful night, but she knew that any such contact could jeopardize not only the case, but also her career. When the trial resumed, the tension in the courtroom became even more pronounced. It was now time for the defense to present its case. Lisa Porter called her first key witness, Officer Daniel Harris, the man who had arrested James Anderson. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she focused intently on Harris. "Officer Harris," Lisa began in a calm yet measured tone, "you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That is correct," Harris replied sharply. "According to your report, Mr. Anderson was seen walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Am I right?" "Yes," Harris confirmed. "What then led you to suspect him?" Harris shifted in his seat, his features matching the description of a black male in his mid-40s, clad in dark clothing. Lisa's eyebrows rose in mild disbelief as she inquired, "You mentioned dark clothing, yet the suspect in the surveillance video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie on Mr. Anderson when you searched him?" Harris hesitated before replying, "No, I did not. It is possible he may have discarded it." Lisa stepped closer, her tone growing more insistent. "Could you or any other officer verify this?" Harris's jaw tightened as he answered, "No, we did not have time to conduct a thorough search of the area. He was apprehended quickly." Lisa pressed on. "So to clarify, you arrested my client based solely on a vague description without any physical evidence linking him to the scene?" Harris's silence spoke volumes, and his inability to offer further details left a murmur of doubt in the courtroom. Eleanor's eyes then drifted to the jury, where several members exchanged glances that revealed uncertainty and growing skepticism. Lisa continued, "Officer Harris, do you recall if Mr. Anderson made any statements at the time of his arrest?" "He did protest his innocence," Harris replied briefly. "But did you investigate his claim, or did you simply assume guilt based on his appearance?" Harris's face flushed as he muttered, "I followed protocol." Lisa repeated the word slowly, emphasizing every syllable. "Protocol." Her tone dripped with skepticism as she concluded, "No further questions, Your Honor." When Officer Harris stepped down from the stand, visibly shaken and with his credibility diminished, the courtroom buzzed with a renewed intensity. Eleanor's heart pounded as she realized that this trial was evolving into something far more than a simple matter of robbery and assault. It had become a reckoning. It was a confrontation with a system that too readily condemned without understanding the full truth behind the evidence. In an unexpected turn, Lisa Porter introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had meticulously reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that based on the height and build of the individual captured on camera, there was no definitive way to confirm the identity of the man in the red hoodie as James Anderson. Moreover, the analyst revealed that the footage's timestamp had been altered, which seriously undermined its reliability. Although the prosecutor attempted to dismiss this testimony as mere conjecture, the jury's expressions betrayed a deepening uncertainty. A shadow of doubt began to creep over the courtroom, its presence almost tangible as the day drew to a close. At long last, James was given the opportunity to testify on his own behalf. Despite warnings from his defense attorney about the risks, he He insisted on taking the stand. As he approached, the soft clinking of chains echoed in the hushed silence. His voice, though low and trembling, carried a raw sincerity that filled the space. "I've made mistakes in my life," he began, addressing the jury directly. "I've taken wrong turns and trusted the wrong people, but I did not commit this crime. That night I was simply walking home, minding my own business when the police stopped me. They did not ask any questions. They merely decided that I fit the bill." His voice cracked as he continued. "I've fought my whole life to be seen as more than what people assume about me, but now I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor's throat tightened as she listened, her eyes never leaving his, for his words were not merely a plea for justice. They were a cry for humanity. Eleanor surveyed the faces in the courtroom. The jury's expressions were a tapestry of doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. In that charged moment, the truth was no longer confined to evidence or testimonies. It had become a battle of conscience, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and assumption. Eleanor understood then that her role transcended mere enforcement of the law. It was her duty to interpret it in a way that served true justice. As the final day of the trial dawned, the courtroom was filled with an anticipatory hush. The closing arguments were delivered with precise articulation. The prosecutor leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust in the established procedures of the legal system. In contrast, Lisa Porter implored the jurors to look beyond the superficial details, to examine the gaps in the prosecution's case, and to recognize the inherent humanity of the man on trial. Eleanor listened with an impassive face, though her mind churned with conflicting emotions. She knew that while she could not directly influence the jury's decision, she would reserve the final word should their verdict leave any ambiguity. The burden of ensuring that justice was served weighed heavily on her. Hours passed as the jury deliberated in that somber chamber. The courtroom emptied and refilled several times, its occupants stretching their legs or engaging in quiet whispers. All the while, James sat motionless, his hands tightly clasped together, his eyes fixed on the table, a silent plea for understanding etched in his gaze. He had looked to Eleanor since the very beginning of the trial, yearning for a reconciliation between the innocence of their shared past and the harsh reality that now confronted him. Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. An unbearable silence fell over the room as 4 jurors rose, and a single piece of paper trembled in Eleanor's steady hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant. The pause that followed was excruciating, each second stretching into eternity. Not guilty. In an instant, the courtroom erupted in a tumult of gasps, murmurs, and even sporadic cheers. Eleanor tapped her gavel sharply, restoring order to the charged atmosphere. James's shoulders sagged as if a tremendous weight had been lifted, yet his face remained unreadable, a mask of quiet relief and lingering sorrow. He had won his freedom, but it was evident that this victory came at an immense personal cost. After the verdict, Eleanor addressed the court with quiet dignity. "The jury has spoken, Mr. Anderson. You are free to go." As the courtroom gradually emptied, Eleanor lingered behind, her gaze fixed on James as he signed his release paperwork. For a brief moment, she wondered if he would leave without a word. Instead, he turned and approached her slowly. With only a few clerks tidying up and Margaret gathering files in the background, James stopped a few feet from the bench. His expression was guarded yet earnest as he spoke softly. "You don't owe me anything, but I would like to know." "Why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Eleanor's throat tightened as she struggled for words. "I couldn't," she finally whispered, "because I had to remain fair. Any personal comment might have jeopardized the case." James regarded her silently, his eyes reflecting a mixture of hurt and understanding. "Fair," he murmured. "That's the thing. This world has never been fair, not for people like me." Eleanor lowered her gaze to the polished wood of the bench, her voice barely audible. "You're right. I wish I had done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." James sighed softly, and the tension in his posture eased slightly. "We were just kids," he said, his voice tinged with melancholy. "We didn't know any better. But you know now, don't you?" "I do," Eleanor replied firmly, her voice heavy with regret. "And I'm truly sorry." With a final, small nod, James turned and walked away, his back straight and determined as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Left alone in the now quiet courtroom, Eleanor sat in reflective silence. The trial had tested her in ways she had never anticipated and revealed a deeper truth. Justice was not solely about rigid verdicts and cold evidence, but about the human lives intertwined with the law. It was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that her position was not simply one of authority, but a platform from which she could strive for meaningful change. As she exited the courtroom that evening, the fading sun cast long, somber shadows across the courthouse steps. In that solitary moment, Eleanor made a silent vow to herself, and to all those who had been affected by the system's failings. She would do everything in her power to ensure that the future held more than hollow promises of fairness. Though the road ahead might be fraught with challenges, she owed it to James and to herself to try. In the months and years that followed, Eleanor's courtroom experience transformed into a personal mission. She revisited the bittersweet memories of her youth with James, the shared dreams and the innocent promises that once bound them. These recollections fueled a fervent determination to reform a justice system that too often reduced individuals to mere statistics. Eleanor began to see her role not only as a guardian of the law, but as an advocate for those who had been overlooked and misunderstood. Eleanor's commitment to change soon resonated beyond the courthouse walls. She spearheaded initiatives to address implicit bias, to ensure transparency in legal proceedings, and to foster a culture of compassion and accountability. Her passionate speeches at community forums and her willingness to mentor young legal professionals gradually began to shift public perception. Eleanor became a beacon of hope, a living example that true justice must incorporate both rigor and empathy. At one particularly memorable community forum, Eleanor addressed a diverse audience of citizens, law enforcement officials, and community leaders. "Our duty," she proclaimed in a clear, resonant voice, "is not only to enforce the law, but to embody its highest ideals. True justice is not achieved by turning a blind eye to prejudice or by allowing the abuse of power to go unchecked. Every individual who walks through our doors is a human being with dreams, struggles, and an inherent right to dignity. I pledge to continue working for a system that honors that truth, where compassion and accountability are inextricably linked." Her words struck a deep chord, and many in the audience left with renewed determination to demand fairness. Eleanor's influence spread steadily over time. Her tireless advocacy began to reform not only the internal culture of her courtroom, but also the broader legal community. She mentored a new generation of judges and legal professionals who shared her vision for a fairer system, and she became a sought-after speaker at national conferences dedicated to justice reform. Her journey, marked by personal sacrifice and unwavering dedication, served as a powerful reminder that change is possible, even within the most entrenched systems. Each case that came before Eleanor now carried an added significance. No longer were legal proceedings merely about applying statutes and handing down sentences. They were opportunities to heal, to restore dignity, and to affirm the humanity of every person who appeared before her. The trial of James Anderson in particular remained etched in her memory as a watershed moment, a day when the intersection of past and present forced her to confront not only the failings of the system, but also her own inner conflicts. Though the trial left a lingering sorrow, it also ignited a fervent resolve within her to forge a future where fairness was not an elusive ideal, but a lived reality for every individual. In one of her final addresses at a high-profile community event, Eleanor spoke with a measured blend of authority and compassion. "Justice," she declared, "is not solely defined by the verdicts we pronounce or the laws we uphold. It is measured by the lives we touch, the hope we inspire, and the future we build together. Every person who enters this courtroom is not merely a case number, but a human being with inherent dignity. I vow to continue working for a system that honors this truth, one where compassion, accountability, and respect for every individual guide our actions." Her words resonated deeply, leaving an indelible impact on all who heard them. As the final day of that long trial drew to a close, Eleanor found herself alone in the silent courtroom, the weight of the day's events pressing upon her. The trial had not only tested her resolve, but had transformed her perspective on justice. It had taught her that truth was multifaceted, that every verdict carried the burden of countless lives, and that the pursuit of justice required a steadfast commitment to empathy as much as to legal precision. With the fading light streaming through the tall arched windows and casting long shadows upon the polished floors, Eleanor made a solemn vow. "I cannot change the past," she murmured, "but I will do everything in my power to build a future founded on true fairness and respect for every human life." In the years that followed, Eleanor's relentless drive for reform began to reshape the culture within the justice system. Her efforts to champion transparency and accountability rippled outward, touching not only her colleagues but also the broader community. Though the scars of past injustices would never fully disappear, her journey, sparked by the trial of James Anderson, became a lasting testament to the belief that meaningful change is always within reach. Eleanor's story, and that of the countless individuals whose lives she touched, stands as a powerful reminder that justice is not merely the enforcement of rules, but the recognition of every person's inherent worth. In the quiet moments of reflection after each long day in court, Eleanor recalled the words of a mentor from her early days on the bench. "The law may be blind, but justice sees." Now, more than ever, those words resonated within her. They served as a guiding light, urging her to look beyond the surface and to embrace the full, complex truth of the human condition. As Eleanor continued to serve with unyielding integrity, she became more than a judge. She became a symbol of hope, a defender of the voiceless, and a tireless advocate for the idea that every individual, regardless of their past, deserved to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity. Thus, as the courthouse doors closed each day and the echo of the gavel's strike faded into memory, Eleanor Hayes carried with her the conviction that her work was far from over. Every case, every trial, and every moment of hardship was a stepping stone toward a more just and compassionate system. A system that would honor the true meaning of fairness and leave a legacy of change for future generations. And so, as she walked away from the courthouse one evening, her silhouette bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, Eleanor made a silent promise to herself and to all those she had vowed to protect, that she would never cease fighting for a world where justice, in its truest sense, prevailed. In that enduring spirit of hope and transformation, Eleanor Hayes' journey continued, inspiring others to challenge the status quo and to stand up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Her legacy, born from the trials and triumphs of her own heart, remains a beacon for those who believe that a fairer, more humane justice system is not just a dream, but an achievable reality. And as the years passed, her tireless dedication ensured that the pursuit of justice would always be marked not only by legal victories, but by the countless lives transformed along the way.